All right, we're live.
Welcome, everyone. This is, I believe, Dave, our fifth podcast of Becoming a True Human. We would like to welcome all of you. Thank you to all of you who have listened. The other thing that Dave and I was just talking about that we would also like to say is to thank you so much for your feedback. We have really enjoyed, and that feedback has been channeled in to this podcast and future ones. So thank you so much. I am one of the co-hosts. My name is Chris Smith. Part of my training is a marriage and family therapist. I have also am a mindfulness meditation teacher. And I was just saying to Dave, I have now a new role. I am now a meditation coach for a seventh grade basketball girls basketball league. So with that, Dave, would you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm Dave Kopacz. I'm a psychiatrist, an author, an artist. I live in Seattle, Washington, and Chris and I like hanging out and talking. And yeah, I think this is our fifth podcast that we're doing now, so it's actually seems like it's picking up momentum.
Today, we're going to kind of approach something that maybe many of you have not heard of. We're going to be talking and exploring spiritual democracy. And what I'd like to do is sort of lean in and begin perhaps, Dave, with a definition or a way to understanding spiritual democracy. And maybe, if you wouldn't mind, why include this now at this
Mm,
particular point in
yeah.
time?
Well, so many different threads to pick up there, Chris. One is we've got the election next week. And so when we were talking about what should we have a podcast before the election or after the election, we thought, okay, let's do it before, and we'll pick the chapter from the book. I've got it in Becoming Medicine. I've got a chapter on spiritual democracy in here, and it comes from, I got the idea from Steven Hermann, a Jungian analyst who wrote a book on spiritual democracy. And then he picked it up from his other book on Walt Whitman. What is that? Shamanism, Spiritual Democracy, and the World Soul, in his study of Whitman. So, and I'll tell a little bit of a story. I mean, how did I get to where I wanted to include that? Spiritual democracy seemed like it captured this intersection between the spiritual path and the activist path. And Herman actually talks about this idea of sacred activism that comes a sort of social movement that comes out of a spiritual sense or spiritual experience. And working with Joseph Rael, Beautiful Painted Arrow, he is always focused on world peace. So all of his teachings, he teaches about mysticism and his visions, but all of them are really geared towards a practical thing, which is how can we plant the seed of kind of spiritual goodness in our everyday lives, and that there's no separation between the things that we do in the mundane reality and the things that we do in the spiritual reality. So the idea of spiritual democracy gave a kind of pathway that brought together Jungian thought, Walt Whitman, poetry, and this idealism too, that sometimes it can be unfashionable to have idealism. Yeah, go ahead, Chris, because I'm going off on a tangent.
Would you say that it brings in aspects of the heart?
Mm,
I mean, that's what where I was into. It really brings in
definitely.
aspects of the heart.
Yeah, definitely. And this is my sort of closing point, but let's go ahead and give it up front. Um, in the book, I came to this idea of like, how would you apply spiritual democracy? And it would mean in politics, whenever we're doing something, we ask ourselves, is this coming from the heart? Is this coming from a sense of bringing us all together in a democratic kind of forum, or is this splitting us off and separating us off? And this was also for the end too, but let's go ahead and do it up front. Parker Palmer, Healing The Heart of Democracy. And he wrote, if American democracy fails, the ultimate cause will not be a foreign invasion or the
Hmm.
power of big money or the greed and dishonesty of some elected official or military coup or the internal communist, socialist, fascist takeover that keeps some Americans awake at night. And he was writing this back in, I think, 2011. There's a new edition now. It will happen because we, you and I, become so fearful of each other, of our differences, and of the future that we unraveled the civic community on which democracy depends, losing our power to resist all that threatens it and call it back to its highest form. So the practical thing is, when we're engaging in political discussions, are we doing it in a way that comes from hatred, or are we doing it in a way that comes from love? That's another way of saying, does this come from the heart or not?
I'm also thinking of the psychologist William James.
Mm.
And one of the things that William James talked about was something very similar. I don't know his work enough to know if he called it spiritual democracy. But one of the things that he did write about was the importance of inclusivity, and inclusivity in approaching things spiritual in terms in some sense of creating a sense of belonging for everyone in a democracy. Are we including everyone? Is something that would come up in some of his work.
Yeah. And so this question, in a way, it's not about one party or another party. It's about how are we all in this respectful of differences, yet working to come together, like the motto of the United States, e pluribus unum, out of many one. How do we bring together the many and come together in a shared sense of we are in this together and we're working with each other and we can trust each other. And that's something that really concerns me with this election coming up, regardless of what the results are. I'm so concerned about the deep divisions within the political parties and within the people of the United States.
Have you seen anything opposite of that, where people are coming together?
Yeah, Parker Palmer, I think, has been a voice in the wilderness, you could say, for a long time, where he's talking about the need to bring people together. Um, I think the idea of spiritual democracy, too, gets us out of our small sense of identity into a larger sense of identity. So how can we have a sense of identity? The greater the sense of identity we can have, the more we're in the realm of the spiritual. The smaller the sense of identity we have, the more we're in the realm of the ego and the extension of the ego, which is, my tribe, my group, my clan versus us. And so Joseph Rael, he'll often talk about being a cosmic citizen. And as I learned more and more about Joseph, I came to really respect how much equanimity he can have. He grew up, so he's Southern Ute. He's enrolled with the Southern Ute tribe, and he grew up for the first few years in the Southern Ute tribe. Then, with World War II, everyone had to, all the different people who belonged to different tribes had to go back and register for the draft in their home tribe. And so his father was from Pickery's Pueblo, and his mother was Southern Ute. So they traveled to northern New Mexico to the Pickery's Pueblo, and his mother got sick and died around that time. And he went into foster care for a period of time, and grew up at Pickery's Pueblo. And when he turned 18, the governor of the Pueblo said, "You're welcome to stay here, but you'll never have a job because you're not from Pickery's." And he said, "But I grew up here, I speak the Tiwa language, I feel like I'm Pickery's." He might have spent, 12 years at that point there of his formative times. And the governor said, "Well, you're Southern Ute. You should go back to your people." So he went back to his people, but he didn't fit in there because he hadn't grown up there. And then he left the reservation And then, white people would say you should go back to the reservation. So he ended up feeling like he didn't fit in anywhere, but he was able to, instead of becoming bitter or cynical, he was able to fit in everywhere. So that was kind of the work that he did to become a cosmic citizen. And I suppose that's the work that we're trying to do now, is how can we move from our narrowly defined identities to an identity that's really truly inclusive and accepting of everybody.
There was a news report, and you might have seen it on Sunday morning, CBS Sunday Morning, and it featured one of our small counties here in Wisconsin. And Wisconsin is sort of shaped like this,
Mm-hmm.
and this is what we call Door County. And this is what they were featuring as Door County. And one of the unique things about Door County, out of all counties, I think, in the United States, is that it has been the only county that has always been able to vote for the person who gets elected. So it could have been Clinton, it could have been Bush. And so what this one reporter did is he went to Door County and he began interviewing different people. And one of the things that to me was rather remarkable is there were two people that stood out for me. The first was a business woman, and she had a shop that sold, maybe I'm going to make this up, but tourist things. It had gyms and just going to have an assortment of things for the tourists that visit. And she made the point that in her community, she knew who was going to vote for this side and who was going to vote for that side. And she said, but in the end, what really matters is that we're here for each other, that we care for each other. And she said, we do. We support each other because our livelihood depends on how we cooperate, collaborate, and work together as a community. And then the camera switched and went to a cattle farmer. And so the cattle farmer, again, was talking about sort of this tradition that Door County has in the elections. And the interviewer asked, he was a dairy farmer. That's what he was. He says, when you come together Thanksgiving, I'm guessing that you're going to have people that vote differently. And he said, oh, yes, that's very true. And he says, well, do you get along? And he said, yes. He says, politics are out. What really matters is that we're a family, that we support each other, that we care for one another, that ultimately that's what's most important. And so again, I felt like that was kind of like an example of an aspect of this spiritual democracy, this inclusivity that you're talking about. But very much, each person having their own individual perspective, that's not taken away. But underneath that is this heart, if I could say, the heart that is much larger, that is there to take care and support and to create communities that support everyone's livelihood, well-being.
Yeah. And the question is, how do we do this? Because I've got a story, several stories I think of, from neighbors, but also from family, of that not happening, of people leaving, ending something early, ending a gathering early and going off mad and not believing how their family member or long-term friend could think that, say that, believe that. And I think coming out of the pandemic too, I saw an article that said road rage is up since the pandemic. And I've really felt that since the pandemic, we haven't really come out of it. In a way, we haven't grieved it. And some of these separations got magnified during the pandemic because you'd think everyone could talk about the pandemic. But, there were these years of masking at family gatherings. And some people would say, why are you masking? And why are you, why are you exposing grandma to COVID? And why are you, making a political statement by wearing this mask? So I don't know. I think it's work. I think spiritual democracy is work. We have to remember where we came from. we have to remember the ideals of democracy and infuse democracy with a spirituality that's not a partisan spirituality, but something that it supports our hearts to open rather than to break apart. That's one of Parker Palmer's things. He says our hearts can break apart, in which they shatter and they wound yourself and others, or our hearts can break open into a greater sense of compassion and acceptance. But it's work.
Yeah, I want to come back to work with some work by Frank Ostaseski. That's hard to say. But I'm wondering if you might speak a little bit about Walt Whitman, because I think one of the things that when I read your book and in the chapter, one of the things that I really took away is really what we're talking about in spiritual democracy has at its root the beginnings and founding of our country. And so there's a legacy there of spiritual democracy. And I'm wondering if you might speak to some of that through, again, what you write about regarding Walt Whitman.
Yeah. Let's see. In this other book of Herman, he's got more of the Walt Whitman quotes. And maybe I'll read one of these. I mean, for Whitman, the Song of Myself,
Yeah.
that was one of the poems that was in Leaves of Grass. And so Whitman, in this sort of ecstatic, poetic way, found the divine within himself, but it wasn't, in finding the divine within himself, it didn't take away from the divine of others. And so he would almost, in a way that was worshipful, would like worship the divine in himself, but at the same time that opened him up to worship the divine in others. And so here's just the passage. This is not a poem, but he said, a man is not greatest as a victor in war, nor inventor or explorer, nor even in science, or in his intellectual or artistic capacity, or exemplar in some vast benevolence. To the highest democratic view, man is most acceptable in living well the practical life and lot which happened to him as an ordinary farmer, seafarer, mechanic, clerk, laborer, or driver, upon and from which position as a central basis or pedestal, while performing its labors and his duties as citizen, son, husband, father, and employed person, he preserves his physique, ascends developing, radiating himself in other regions, and especially where and when, greatest of all and nobler than the proudest mere genius or magnet in any field, he fully realizes the conscience, the spiritual, the divine faculty, cultivated well, exemplified in his deeds and words, through life, uncompromising to the end. So, what he's speaking about is recognizing this sense of divinity within. And the democratic part then is that everyone has this divinity and that we reach the highest state of conscience or spiritual living, again, not in a particular religious sect, but in a sense of being kind to each other, creating a democracy and an economy and a country and a culture that's kind. We reach that when we recognize that no one's above another person and no one is below another person, and every person has divinity. And we could even then, with the transcendentalists, we could even expand that to nature, that nature with a capital N also had a divinity within it, and that we would lose in our own divinity if we took away the divinity of nature.
And just a footnote with that quote, that's based in masculine language, which
Thank you.
was
Yeah.
very
Right.
much part of that time period. And
Yeah.
of course, if we would write it today, we would probably write it differently.
Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to bring out is Whitman, I think he participated in the Civil War and was a medic or nurse. And so I'm just thinking that probably shaped some aspect of spiritual democracy. And I'm thinking it also might have had some effect, if I could speak metaphorically, on the breaking of one's heart, of seeing suffering and terrible tragedy.
Yeah. Do I have that in this book, or it might be in my hero's journey book? Because I talk about that with veterans about Whitman's role in the Civil War as a nurse. And he did this, it was kind of voluntary position. He would use his own money just to buy people snacks or, get them some clean socks or some writing materials. And he would sit with people, even, kind of in almost like a hospice way, sitting with people while they died or when they suffered, and found within that some sort of sense of a greater sense of himself in helping others.
Which again makes me think about, this is a little pivot, so forgive me, but some of the research that I've been exploring, and part of the research looked at studies where one does things for themselves, sometimes what we call self-care. I'm not against self-care, but in terms of study, in terms of what people receive from that compared to when they offer themselves, like in volunteering and helping other, the satisfaction, the sense of purpose, the sense of even one's health and well-being seems greater in a number of studies when we, do things for other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to get back to you have something, go ahead.
Yeah, can I follow up with that? So there's interesting neuroscience research that looks at brain imaging of people when they're experiencing empathy or when they're experiencing compassion. And the way they define empathy is feeling with someone else. So when somebody else is hurting and you observe them and they're looking at your brain, the pain circuits in your brain light up. So you feel the pain that that other person is feeling. In compassion, which they define as empathy plus action, the reward circuits light up. So you're still present with the person's pain, but in acting to try to, and it doesn't mean you have to take their pain away, but just that you address their pain, you recognize their pain, you try to be with them in their pain, it actually lights up the reward circuit in yourself. And so, for Whitman and that role, some people, it could have gotten too overwhelming and they pull back within themselves and they feel traumatized. But it seems that for him, he found it almost as like the test case for his poetry, for everything he believed, to be able to give of himself in such a way that he felt refueled and refilled by that reward circuit lighting up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to this real thing that potentially could happen to all of us in the next week or after, of being at a dinner, could be even walking with someone, could be talking to someone in the neighborhood, seeing someone at the gym or in your apartment building on the street, that again may have some of this experience that you described of hearing people talk about whatever happens the election and just feeling like they would run away. And some of this, for me, I happened to be in a silent retreat last weekend. And as part of the silent retreat, one of the things that we looked at, it's called what's called the 5 invitations to meet life as it is. And there's a book by that. And I'm going to attempt this person's name again, but it's Frank Ostaseski. He is a
You want to spell it?
Yeah, it's Ostaseski. He is a Zen teacher and has spent a lot of time developing, creating work in Zen hospice, so caring for those persons who are experiencing the dying process. And as we were talking and preparing for this, his work came up for me. And one of the first invitations of meeting life as it is this idea of welcoming everything, pushing away nothing. And so part of it is there's a lot of life and we were talking about this prior to recording, that we don't always like, or we don't always approve or disapprove. And our task with this particular invitation is simply to listen and to pay attention and to notice how that experience may change or maybe not change. But it's kind of like developing, if you will, this fearless receptivity to the present moment as best as we are able. And in that, perhaps, and I think this gets at a little bit of the spiritual democracy piece. In this way, our journey can become sort of one of a continuous discovery in which we might be entering new territory, or we might be in the position of seeing things or seeing things differently. Again, not having an idea of how it's going to turn out. And it does take a certain amount of courage and flexibility, balance, if you will. But part of this idea is living into our open hearts. And that this is kind of like a mystery, an ongoing mystery that we live into as best as we can, opening, risking, and dare I even say at times forgiving ourselves and others. So that would be one of those invitations that we thought about sharing today.
Can you lead us in a brief practice on this? How would somebody put this? What does fearless receptivity and continuous discovery? I'd say I'm 100% in for that. And then I'm in a social situation and, I'm tired or I'm not feeling well, or all of a sudden I get stressed and I get triggered and I'm in, you know, fight or flight, and you're threatening my being, you're threatening my democracy.
Yeah, yeah. So
My democracy instead of our democracy. But yeah, how would you implement this in like a practice?
yeah, great question. So I think one of the first things that we might invite is sort of what you already have us engaged with, is knowing, uh, uh, having an awareness and to be attentive. And so one of the things that we may be attentive, and this happens to me every day if I turn on the TV and watch the political ads, I feel something in my body. I notice thoughts. Um, I have different feelings. And so part of the practice is in that moment, as best as we can. And think about this now, this particular moment that we all are sharing. Just taking a minute here and noticing what you feel in your body and where you feel it in your body, bringing your awareness and attention, and also bringing a sense of compassion and kindness. It's not that we have to fix this. It's not that we have to do anything. It's almost to me kind of like the image of sitting on the bank and we're watching a branch float down the river. And this branch happens to be our present moment sensations that we feel in the body. And it could be a sense of warmth. It could be pain, different sensations of pain. It could be pulsing. But just to see if it's possible in this particular moment to bring in some sense of what you experience in your body. And you'll notice right now, we're not going for the home run. We're really trying to start where we are right now. It's not that we have to do the most very difficult thing. And sometimes it may be best to start here in this moment, not pushing anything away. So we spend some time with the body, just noticing that. And then next, we begin also looking at what are the emotions that are expressing themselves in this moment. And so it could be irritated, could be calm, I'm thinking of a poem by Rumi, The Guest House.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
like, who is here right now? And welcoming, even if they're a bunch of sorrows, as Rumi would say, that arranged all of the furniture in your house. Some relatives, friends can do that, you know. Some political ads can do that. Can we just simply allow ourselves just to notice without having to do anything? Sense of emotion like a branch floating down the stream. We're just watching it, observing it, even possibly bringing a sense of curiosity. And then we'll transition to thoughts and thinking. Just noticing, again, there could be reactive thoughts, there could be compassionate thoughts. If you're like me, when this just happens to be what's in my mind, when I see a political ad, I have a lot of thoughts, and just noticing the thoughts and just allowing them to be, not having to do anything, but knowing that they're just thoughts. Again, picturing thoughts as if they were that branch floating down the stream, just allowing them to be, allowing them to come and go, come and go. And so in this way, with body sensations and emotions and thoughts, as best as we can, we're welcoming everything. We're not pushing anything away. Just allowing, the sense of allowing. And then one of the things that I've been doing in the practice is, after sort of the effort, if you will, some of the effort we put into this practice, just letting it go. And just allow yourself to rest just for a moment. Just allow, you know, kind of when the shoulders come down, you go, just allow yourself just to rest. And that would be one
Mhm.
practice.
Yeah, I like that. That's similar to the I rest practice, integrative restoration, which would be, you know, body, body sensing, emotion sensing, thought sensing. That would add breath, you know, the flow of the breath through. And then the next step is to kind of move up into more of the non-dual space. And in, you know, my writing, like Rehumanizing Medicine, Caring for Self and Others, I talk about the different dimensions of the human being. And so there's the body, the emotions, and the mind. I think of those as the ego. You know, that's our our self that we think of in day-to-day life. And then the next step up from that is the heart. In the heart, you start to move into a transpersonal or non-dual perspective. The heart balances the me into more of the we, and then the spirit is even another level of moving from the heart um, into a larger we. We're all in this together. Um,
The,
I,
the
uh,
oh,
yeah. What did you want to bring up? I wanted to bring up a super synopsis of the Hiawatha story that I've got in the book.
Let me just add this little piece and then we'll
Mhm.
talk about Hiawatha. So part of what we did at the end is another part of the invitation from some of this work, which is to find a place to rest
Mhm.
in the middle of things.
Mhm.
I think this is really important. It's something, Dave, you and I have talked about in terms of working with illness, how important it is in the middle of things, for naps, for actual rest.
Mhm.
Um, but this part of how we may be bombarded by, again, advertisements and commercials and flyers in your mailboxes, but how important this piece of also including rest, of taking time um, to sit down, taking time to walk, taking time to enjoy a meal, but this piece of rest is important. And I just wanted to loop that in because we kind of
Yeah,
included it at the end. And
I like
so,
that.
yeah.
And this is something that I find endlessly fascinating is there's meditation techniques with the breathing where you're watching the breath, and some techniques where you pause between breaths. And in that space between the in breath, I think of, it's this sort of active taking in of things, and the out breath is this sort of passive, relaxing, letting go of things. And when we have something we don't want, we want to get rid of it, or with something we do want, we're trying to bring more of that in. But there's the space, if we can rest within that space between breaths and just prolong it a little bit, it may give us some breathing space, quite literally some breathing space in a difficult situation.
It reminds me, and I can't confirm if this is true, Dave, but someone told me that marathon runners, elite runners, athletes, there's this moment when a runner is pushing off with one foot, and before the other foot lands, that they've trained their body to rest.
Hmm.
And that, I don't know, millisecond. But you can see over time through 26 miles, that could have really important impact on one's ability to, continue
Mhm.
and to kind of move forward in running.
Yeah. Mike, they're like micro compassions. I've really
Yes.
gotten interested in this idea. We've got microaggressions. We want to avoid those, but we also want to put something in their place. So micro compassions where we can have a micro self-compassion for ourselves. And I think compassion, we can't have compassion for ourselves without the others. That's why I write caring for self and others. Caring is caring, compassion is compassion. If it's really compassion, it has to flow and envelop both the individual and the person receiving it into the creation of a little compassionate moment or a compassionate space. So creating that micro compassion for yourself where you say, it's okay that my ego is reacting, that my body feels like it's in fight or flight, that I feel like I just need to say something back, and I feel like I'm under threat somehow. That's what's happened in our democracy, is discussing political positions has reached a point where people feel that they're physically threatened by the opinion or the viewpoint of the other person. And so, taking that micro compassion, that space between breaths to say, I'm going to try to get my poor, struggling body out of fight or flight. We've been through a pandemic. That's been hard. I've tendency to go into fight or flight from that. We've been through this political division. I have a tendency to, these buzzwords that will trigger us. So how can I take a moment of micro compassion to find this rest within the marathon that we're running, this marathon of spiritual democracy that we're in right now?
Yeah, well
Yeah,
said.
yeah. I wanted to just mention a couple points from the story. Um, so this is Jacob Needleman's The American Soul. And I came across this book when I was writing the chapter. He's a philosopher, and I came across this book when I was writing that chapter. And this story about Hiawatha fits so well into it. And, of course, I had sort of these reservations about cultural appropriation, writing from about a story that wasn't necessarily my story to tell. And yet, I feel like Needleman's point was in telling this story about the foundation of the Iroquois foundation, that this influenced the founding thinkers of the United States as well. So it's bound up. The story that happened in the land and with the indigenous culture is bound up within our story of ourselves as Americans in the United States. So I hope that it doesn't offend anybody by telling a little bit of the story. But I'll give like a synopsis. And Hiawatha too. I didn't know about this. Hiawatha, I thought about the Longfellow poem, but there's a Hiawatha who is more of a historical figure with the founding of the Iroquois confederacy where everybody came together, the Iroquois nations, where everyone came together, the separations were brought together into a greater strength. And so when Needleman is talking about this story, he talks about the beginning of the almost like a creation story, a creation. Here it is. Like every culture has a creation myth or creation story of how they came to be who they are. And so this story starts with two brothers who were born, and one is called When He Grasps the Sky with Both Hands, and the other is called When He Who is Crystal Ice is the other one. And one of them remembers where they came from, coming from this sense of divine or sacredness. And the other one, When He Who's Crystal Ice, he looks around and he says, I'm not thinking about the place where I came from. It's sufficient that my mind is satisfied with having arrived in this place. This place will become exceedingly delightful and amusing to the mind. So when He Who's Crystal Ice thinks, okay, well, I'm going to play around with this place. I can make it work for me. So, but when he who grasps the sky with both hands, he gives these instructions he creates human beings, and he puts a little bit of himself in each of the human beings, and he tells them, be good, remember who you are, remember where you came from, remember you have the divine within. But you know what? You're human beings. You're going to forget this at some point. And when you forget it, I'm going to send an emissary to come and remind you. And so this emissary turns out to be, there's the great peacemaker comes, and he's coming to bring this message of peace and the new mind to everybody, so that talking will replace killing. And then he finds his connection, his human connection is through Hiawatha. And Hiawatha is a cannibal. He's this guy who eats other people. And there's this amazing scene where Great Peacemaker crawls up on top of Hiawatha's hut and is looking down at him, and Hiawatha's brewing the stew of human body parts. And Hiawatha looks into the reflection and he sees Great Peacemaker's face, and he's overcome. He's like, I didn't believe I had this beauty within me. Mm-hmm. And he has this sort of moral conversion where this person who is a cannibal then is the person who ends up being able to, I won't tell the whole story necessarily, but he ends up being able to comb the snakes out of the hair of the person who's the greatest resistor to the great peace. So, and there's a place where Needleman says, we have to remember that none of us is perfect. Everyone has our own shadow. The person who was able to help bring about the great peace was actually somebody who ate other human beings, was this cannibal. And there's something just beautiful in that story. I just would read and reread that the moment when Hiawatha would see in the reflection this other view of himself, and his own divinity, and then to share that with others. So I think this is important too when we're staring into our soup, our Thanksgiving soup or Thanksgiving gravy, and we feel like strangling the person across the table from us, or we feel like launching into some sort of barrage of talking points. To look into our gravy and to try to see, can I see my divinity? My sense of spiritual democracy. Is there some little glimmer there that will support me in trying to do the work of spiritual democracy at the dinner table?
It reminds me of another story that, and I can't remember all of the context, but there was a particular king, and I think this king was from India, and very much vicious, was very much the what is it with ice?
He who's born with crystal ice, or
Yeah. And really went about ruling the kingdom with war and with fear, probably lots of commercials, that, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but kind of that kind of separation. And one of the battles that this particular king.
Are you talking about Ashoka?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Happened to see.
I think he did use advertising. I mean, there are pillars and things around early advertising from
That's
him, yeah.
true.
At least the later stages, yeah.
But saw a monk walking across the battlefield caring for the different people that were hurt or wounded. And just your word, equanimity, um, was just, the king was so taken by it, and wanted to know more. And then through that experience and talking with the monk, went about to creating really a kingdom around some of these, really, I would even say spiritual democracy that included inclusivity, that really moved away from this sort of fear and tyranny. And you're right, I think some of the advertisements are still there, engraved in stone in different places in India. You probably know more, Dave.
No, I mean, I just know Ashoka was, was a very warlike ruler who then converted to Buddhism and, created a more of a spiritual democracy. I'm not sure how far down the scale it went to, the idea of untouchables or,
Yeah.
you know, different types of elevations of citizens, of all citizens being equal, but at least not fighting, not separating. Instead of separating, bringing things together. I mean, there are these two things, like with our breathing, actually. We have the breathing in, where we're bringing together, and the breathing out, where we're separating. And then the spitting out, where we're like, patooey, I don't want that, And then the breathing in of like, okay, my heart is breaking. Oh, this is how I thought maybe we could end. Our hearts are breaking individually, as a country. They've been breaking for years. They broke through the pandemic. They've been breaking politically for a long time. They're breaking with the climate crisis. They're breaking with economic crisis. And so our hearts are going to break. And going back to Parker Palmer, the choice we have is how our heart's going to break. Do they break apart and shatter? Are they rigid and defended? And when they break, do they wound ourselves and wound others and cause more and more heartbreak? Or are we able to somehow find a way to let our hearts break open, to breathe open into a space of compassion, to find that space, the micro compassion within the breath, the pause between breaths, to remember each of us carries this sort of divinity and this sacred spirituality. Or do we retreat into the narrow confines of our mind and our emotions and our bodies? So that's our challenge, our spiritual democracy work, I think, for the next week and probably longer than that.
Just curious, as we begin to wind down, any other words or a particular practice as a way of sort of winding down?
Yeah, we could do a mini practice on that breaking open or breaking apart. So, find your comfortable meditative or contemplative space. Take a breath in. Take a breath out. Bring your awareness to the center of your chest, to your heart. You can even put your hand on it. And now picture your least favorite political figure and pay attention to what happens in your heart and your breath and your mind and your emotions. Just watch it. You don't have to react or do anything. And then I know for me, I'm feeling, tension and tightness, and I sort of involuntarily held my breath. And so see if these are feelings of breaking apart, or take a breath in, giving yourself some micro compassion, taking a breath out, finding that space between one breath and the next, and asking yourself, is there a way I can break open, even a little bit, And is there a way I can break apart a little less? Chris, you'll often say this about, is there a way that you can find 5% more relaxation in your present moment? You know, that tipping point, if we can tip 5% into breaking open and 5% out of breaking apart, that may help us. So again, taking a breath in, breath out. And recognizing that everyone at the dinner table is just like me, just like you. All the politicians, they're just like you too. They're people, they're human beings doing what they think is right. You don't have to believe with it or believe it or go along with it. But everyone's doing what they think is right. And our job as a people, as a country, as a democracy, is to try to do this work of the heart, to feel what it feels like to break apart, and to choose rather to break open, to soften the edges, to create a little space instead of a reaction, you know, to create a little space before you react within that breath. So you could play around with this, the feeling of what it feels like to break apart and the feeling of what it feels like to break open. Practice that awareness before you go into the situations coming up in the next period of time. Taking another breath, breathing into the heart and the body, and breathing out. Slowly opening your eyes and coming back to this shared place where we all are working to live together. I don't know. Joseph Rael would say, many people have been working for world peace, and we haven't got there yet. But you and I have been doing this too long to give up now, so I guess we better roll up our sleeves and keep working.
Great way to end our time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.